Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. So a few weeks ago in episode 3, I talked about emotions. And today I want to talk about some of the ways that we can work with strong emotions, but also about the need for stillness and space if we're going to be able to do that without getting completely lost in just more thinking. If we're not just going to end up in some kind of loop. So there are some things that are just guaranteed to spoil everybody's day. Like criticism and blame just gets you right there, or loss or failure or whatever. It's really hard not to take these things personally, anything that feels like a threat to the ego. And it doesn't matter if we know that it's going to pass, it's not permanent. It doesn't matter that we know it's something that everybody experiences, everybody gets blame and loss and criticism sometimes. Still stings, still hurts, at least for a little while. And it can be quite funny actually, the ego can be quite funny, especially when we get all self-righteous or defensive. And that sense of self just seems to expand to something huge. It doesn't feel so great at the time, but afterwards we can sometimes see the funny side. So did you ever find yourself getting so obsessed with being right that you became just a huge giant black hole of judgment? And it felt like you were occupying the exact center of the universe and pulsating and throwing out waves of disapproval whilst there were whole galaxies and star systems just revolving around you. That's what the ego does as a way of doing that, especially when it's feeling threatened. At least mine does anyway, occasionally. And there's just this voice that's crying, me, me, me. And for me, at some point, I managed to come back to being mindfully aware of the breath in the body, and I start to notice what's going on. And then I can stop obsessing about being right or fantasizing about arguments that I should have won, and I can laugh about it. So forgive me if what I'm about to say here is rather obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. Our emotions are temporary. They don't last that long. They're not always that accurate. And sometimes we take them far too seriously. All of us, yes we do. Even you. Even really clever people like us can end up rolling around in the mud sometimes with saying hurtful things or acting from a place of anger or irritation. And we assume the worst in other people. And if you don't believe me, take a look at the news, take a look at the public discourse. And again, at the risk of stating the obvious, it's a really good thing to be able to regulate our emotions. If we're about to do something or say something harmful, it's really good to be able to pause, just to allow the rational part of the brain to take over. It's that part of it's actually the prefrontal cortex that soothes us. It stops us hitting anybody. It just brings us back to being rational. So does that mean that emotions are a bad thing? Is it as simple as just saying we shouldn't have them? Of course, that's not true. Emotions are not a bad thing. They just are what they are. And I talked recently about how emotions arise as a feeling in the mind, but also a feeling in the body. And then we put a label on them. And emotional energy arises in the primitive part of the brain, and then physiological changes happen in the body. And we create a story to go with the feelings. And we create all sorts of meaning around those feelings, and we attach a great deal of importance to them. And that's all right, that's completely natural. But we don't actually have to get tangled up in them. So one problem is that we don't just have feelings about our experiences, we also have feelings about our feelings. And we have a whole repertoire of stories that we tell ourselves about our emotions, about whether it's okay to have those feelings, whether we're justified in how we're feeling. And we can often get quite self-critical about our emotions, especially when we're at our most vulnerable. We can end up in a mess of guilt and shame and self-justification. And it's a mess that meditators can be particularly susceptible to, actually. We can have unrealistic expectations of ourselves. We can even think we should be able to rise above the messy stuff by now. So if you take the expectation that life should feel good most of the time into your meditation practice, it's going to lead to disappointment. It's just another kind of self-view for us to identify with. But here's some good news. Emotions are just fine, and their energy can be used as fuel for our practice. They can help us to gain a better understanding and awareness of our own inner world, and they can give us the impetus to awaken. But it does require us to be willing to get right up close, and it means sensing into what's really going on. It means familiarizing yourself with the true nature of your feelings and the labels that you put on them, and the fact that they don't last, their impermanence, the fact that they change. We get familiar with the way that they arise and they pass, and they arise and they pass. And eventually we realize the impossibility of things feeling pleasant all of the time. So don't get tangled up in words like should and ought. The thing is just to pay attention to what's arising, because there's wisdom behind all emotions, even the ones that challenge us. So things like fear and sadness and anger and shame. Some level, they're all rooted in very real needs and desires, like the need for safety or connection or love or acceptance. And that might not be expressed very well, and we might be confused about them. But at a foundation level, that's what they are. The thing is to learn just to be with them, to allow them, and to know the physical sensations that accompany them, and then just accepting your humanity. So what we do is we slow down and we listen. Now, it's a common misconception that meditation practice is all about transcendence, that we're transcending our messy world. And I really don't attach much weight to transcendence. For me, embodiment is much more important, just grounding and breathing and coming back to the body, and maybe allowing in some compassion. And then we discover that the awakened person and the messy human being with all their emotions are actually the same person. So next time you experience a strong emotion that you wish you didn't have, just try this. Just get up close and intimate with the actual physical sensations. Don't try and suppress the sensations. If they become stronger while you're observing them, that's okay. And then staying in the body, just explore what it is that's underneath that emotion. And maybe there is a wish for things to be different. Maybe there's a wish for someone to stop causing harm to you or themselves or others. Maybe there's a wish for something painful to go away. And it can be hard to stay with this because our minds will do all sorts of mental acrobatics to avoid staying with what's there. And one of the ways that we do this is to fill our time with noise and drama. And that's why there's so much value in practicing stillness and actually learning to slow down and listen. Ram Dass said, "Be still. The quieter you become, the more you can hear." The quieter you become, the more you can hear. So here's a suggestion for you. Every day, offer yourself some space. Take some time out. Offer yourself that gift. And the writer Joseph Campbell, he wrote about sacred space, which he described as somewhere you can find yourself over and over again. So allow yourself some sacred space. I'm actually going to read out what he wrote. He said about sacred space, he said, "It's an absolute necessity for anybody today. You must have a room or a certain hour or so a day when you don't know what was in the newspapers that morning, you don't know who your friends are, you don't know what you owe anybody. You don't know what anybody owes you. This is a place where you can simply experience and bring forth what you are and what you might be. This is the place of creative incubation. At first, you may find that nothing happens there, but if you have a sacred space and use it, something eventually will happen. Something eventually will happen." I think if he was around today, he might also have said something about putting down your devices for a little while. So we're very good at ignoring or blocking what our emotions are telling us. And our inner listening is often drowned out by the monkey chatter of our internal dialogue. And creating a quiet space, a sacred space, allows us to listen in a deep, receptive, caring way. And if we can keep a patient, friendly attitude towards whatever comes up, then we're creating the conditions for growth. And it maybe means giving that critical inner voice a little bit of a rest for a while, because self-criticism can paralyze us. And in our sacred space, we don't need to block our emotions out. We don't need to obsess about them either. We don't need to rise above them. We just listen. We just drop the questions into the well and we just listen for an answer. So here's a challenge for you, and you can call it homework if you like. Sometime over the next 7 days, why not find somewhere to meditate outdoors in nature, even if it's just for a few minutes, because nothing supports the opening of the heart like being in a park or a woodland or on a beach, sitting on a bench or a rock or a tree stump, listening to the birds, listening to the waves or the breeze, and doing it without expectations, just allowing yourself some sacred space. Remembering that most of our brain activity happens at an unconscious level, so we're just slowing down and listening and opening up and getting to know ourselves a little bit better. So that's what I wanted to say today. Thank you for listening. See you again next time.